Like many of you, I had heard of the fabled blue zones, those peculiar pockets of people around the world where individuals live in health and vitality to a ripe old age, well in excess of other communities. As I searched the internet, I came across a series of videos by Michelin-rated Swedish chef Niklas Ekstedt. Sorry, not that Swedish chef. Who is a Gen X 40-something, starting to feel his mortality and the effects of stress in running 3 restaurants and a young family. Being interested in healthy cooking prompted him to travel to all 6 of the key blue zones recognised around the world to interview prominent local scientists and immerse himself in the cultures of those communities to see if he can apply some lessons to his own life. It was quite a fascinating series to follow, and in this video I try to summarise the important takeaways from each community and try to make sense of the big picture in a way we can all learn from. So if you want to live to 100, stay vital and active, join me as I follow Niklas in his journey of discovery, and stick around to the end where I outline 7 key strategies to give you too the best chance of hitting triple figures. But before we begin, please take a moment to like and subscribe for updates, and if you enjoy our content, please click on the PayPal link in the description section below to leave a donation and help keep this unfunded educational channel going. Don't forget to share and leave a comment, and as always, thanks for watching. Niklas travels to the mountainous interior of Sardinia, which is a territory of Italy and has been identified as a blue zone in peculiar difference to the coastal regions of the island, which, despite their shared genetics, have aging statistics in line with the rest of Italy. The legendary longevity of Sardinian mountain people was well known even in Roman times, and much research has been conducted by anthropologists into this relatively closed community, descended from ancestors who fled from the coast to the mountains to avoid all the many invaders and brigands over history. These people maintain a close-knit traditional family clan structure, living as shepherds in relative poverty compared to their more urban coastal cousins. Some speculation has it that the mountain air and scented forests make for respiratory and even cardiovascular benefits, or that the aromatic herbs growing on the mountainside have health benefits for both the people and the goats that they use for meat, as well as low-tech cheese making. In this case, world-famous Sardinian cheese called Casa Axadu and their ricotta. These mountain people don't eat fish or seafood at all, unlike their coastal cousins, but instead eat plenty of fat through the cheese, small goods and goat meat they depend on, which is probably nevertheless rich in omega-3 essential fatty acids. They do consume olive oil though, and again not in the same quantities as is typical for the much vaunted Mediterranean diet. But they do have a varied and seasonal dependence on vegetables and stews, typical of mountain people, most of which is grown locally or picked wild. Mountain honey is also touted as a healthful addition to their diet, and like all Italians, they consume pasta in various forms, but always handmade, in skills passed down from older to younger generations, which gives meaning and purpose for older people who are venerated as custodians of traditional knowledge. Niklas was told that these communities specifically choose to maintain their traditional lifestyles, and they reject the modernization that would make them more efficient producers, or for that matter wealthy, with even young people who are away at university returning each weekend to help with farm work and chores. The mountainous terrain requires them to walk long distances through steep ravines as they tend to their flocks of goats, and their milking is manual and labour-intensive, which requires a strong degree of physical fitness in both men and women. While technology is available, the demands of farm work mean that there is little leisure time for social media or other distractions, and the traditional framework of family life makes conversation and socialising the centre of post-work activity. such that their lifestyle is little changed from that of 6,000 years ago, where the first evidence of occupation of these areas is to be found. So, to summarise the mountains of Sardinia, they have strong family bonds and commonly engage in multi-generational living. Strongly divergent gender roles, and the elderly are held in high esteem and veneration. They breathe isolated mountain air and live in pristine natural terrain that may contain herbaceous medicinal properties. There is a conscious rejection of modernity and an intentional preservation of customs and traditional culture, even among the young who return regularly to participate in farm life. Their lifestyles are viewed as unique, and they come together as a community to teach each other the skills they need and assist one another in times of difficulty. They eat organic, homegrown, home-cooked foods with little scope for packaged industrial food, though they eat diets high in fat, home-baked breads and fresh pasta. Olive oils and vegetables are plenty. There appears to be no prohibition on alcohol or tobacco, and alcohol such as wine, distillates and liqueurs such as limoncello are typically homemade. There is a necessary emphasis on physical conditioning by walking the hills and valleys after their goats, as well as in the milking, cheese making and general farm work done by both men and women. Nicoya is a peninsula and region on the Pacific coast of Costa Rica. Like many rural communities throughout Central America, there is significant poverty, illiteracy and disadvantage, yet the Nicoya community has long been identified as a blue zone, with their old-aged population having mortality rates well below other cities with similar ethnic, socio-economic and geographical conditions. Nicholas travels to Nicoya and interviewed a number of locals, as well as scientists, to try and identify the key characteristics that might explain this statistical outlier. He spent some time with a local family who lived on a cattle ranch in which each member of the multi-generational family lived and worked together closely, younger members taking over the workload of the older ones as their abilities declined, but still treating them with due veneration and respect. Children were raised in relative freedom, except when doing chores or learning practical outdoor farm skills like horse riding and cattle mustering. Nicholas was astonished to learn that the 100-year-old granddad was actually not even their relative. He was a farmhand who had worked on the ranch for over 50 years and just ended up staying on when he got too old, being accepted and cared for by the family as one of their own. The old man's view on longevity was that there was no secret to it, just hard work on the land and to keep active as much as possible, riding a horse or walking wherever you needed to go. Life on the farm revolved around the cattle, moving them to new, meagre, semi-arid pastures early in the morning, and then later in the day, when it was too hot to work, deal with the smaller menial jobs that were less oppressive. There was no sense of urgency, and the people of the region were generally well known for being friendly, cheerful, and having a motto of living la vida pura, or the simple life. Nicholas was introduced to a strong alcoholic beverage fermented from the sugary heart of a local palm that was reputed to be an elixir of vitality given to both children and adults, but the health benefits of which was concluded to be more likely a myth than reality. Their diets consisted of a staple of beans, ancient varieties of corn, usually in the shape of tortillas, along with vegetables, eggs and meats when they could afford it. Basically, local indigenous staples grown at home without pesticides, fertilizers or excess processing. It was hardly what we might call a diverse, nutritionally dense diet, but a subsistence diet typical of poor people the world over, cooked on wood-burning stoves, producing substantial ambient smoke that would hardly be healthy to breathe. There seemed to be little school activity going on, with the emphasis on education clearly directed at farm work. Such kids might be expected to travel through the bush, to search and pick herbs for a sick family member, avoid injury, predators and the cold, build a shelter or tools to achieve their objectives, and solve problems on their own, something many parents in our society today find frustratingly lacking in our own youth. Nicoyan communities regularly come together for fiestas, horsemanship and bull riding tournaments that provides them with a sense of community pride and spirit. It gives the older generation scope for mentorship and the younger opportunities for public acclaim and honours, social credit and the attention of the opposite sex. So what can we say about the Nicoya community in summary? They clearly had strong family bonds with multi-generational living that extends beyond their own blood relatives, that would create a strong character of empathy, understanding and emotional tolerance. They showed a non-obsession with material wealth, but a closeness to the land which gives one plenty of time to think and remain connected to reality, rather than, as we do, live in the abstract under constraints of time and the pressures of wealth acquisition. They have pride in their gaucho culture and maintaining traditional values through high community immersion in the teaching of artisanal, domestic and gender-specific skills to the younger generation, whether at home or through their many voluntary activities in town. Their diet is simple, poor even, but relies on organic, homegrown, home-cooked foods, especially legumes, corn products, vegetables, with no industrially processed or fast food. They have no particular prohibition on alcohol or tobacco, though it was hard to ascertain if there was any endemic alcoholism or substance abuse, as is common in more urban areas. They certainly had no qualms about giving kids their home-brewed palm wine, in contrast to our own paranoid anxieties in the Anglosphere. And finally, they have an ethic of strong physical labour, particularly relating to farm work and horsemanship performed by men, or other domestic jobs often performed by women in traditional ways, without the aid of white goods or kitchen appliances. Indeed, studies show a reasonably parallel longevity in both men and women. In the episode on Loma Linda, Niklas takes a completely different tack and travels to the United States to visit a city on the outskirts of Los Angeles, whose population is largely comprised of members of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. They have created a community in which both the social fabric and business environment largely reflect the ethics of this church, and whose elders have comprised a contemporary blue zone, quite literally an oasis of vitality, in the otherwise abysmal health disaster currently unfolding in America. Seventh-day Adventists are a modern Christian evangelical Protestant church that adheres to traditional observances such as the Sabbath being on Saturday rather than Sunday. They believe in the imminent return of Jesus and, along with him, an apocalyptic judgment day just around the corner. A strong part of their discipline of righteous behaviour involves the doctrine of treating their own bodies like a temple, such that healthy living and vitality are integral to their moral code. To that end, dietary guidelines based on a foundation of vegetarianism, whole foods and the avoidance of alcohol, tobacco, caffeine and other stimulants or addictive substances are at the heart of their community beliefs. These views further encourage the maintenance of physical vitality and vigour by encouraging exercise. Many older Adventists in the city adhere to a regular exercise schedule in specially built facilities, where they also have the opportunity to socialise, and Niklas was surprised at the vitality of many octo and nonagenarians during his visit. It was also clear that there was a strong community spirit, with older people participating in a wide range of voluntary and social work among their fellows. They had their own university, with a strong curricular emphasis on validating their own nutritional beliefs, make of that what you will, as well as compulsory attendance at religious instruction by all students. Like most evangelical churches, the Adventists have a strong missionary ethos, and they are also well known for building infrastructure to support their own communities, such as schools, retirement homes, and hospitals. Niklas discusses the values and principles that both members and church leaders believe to be at the core of their success, and it becomes apparent that while their dietary and exercise regimen gets most of the credit, individual old people place a lot of emphasis on their faith, and through this, their peace of mind and community engagement. So we can summarize the key characteristics of this community as having strong religious beliefs or a cultural identity, which helps to mitigate stress by unburdening themselves from the things that are out of their power to control. In other words, letting God take care of things. Their cultural identity gives them psychological grounding and an existential certainty that reduces worry and depression. They have a high community immersion, which sociologists refer to as social capital, that prevents loneliness, isolation, and fear. It also promotes a strengthened cultural fabric. In a similar vein, their high levels of voluntary activity helps to cement community cohesion, as well as reduce the general divide by keeping everyone connected and cared for. Many of the older members had a history of farm life, and their vegetarian philosophy leads many of them to have environmentalist leanings, a greater empathy for animals, and desire for more time spent in nature or the outdoors. Their diets are tightly regulated with a strong foundation in vegetarianism, whole foods, and dietary discipline. This particularly relates to their aversion to alcohol, stimulants, and drug use. The body as temple mentality brings a natural focus on physical fitness and an active lifestyle. We certainly have a number of long-term studies that show maintaining general physical strength to be a strong predictive variable in longevity and quality of life. Niklas now travels to Ikaria, a small Greek island quite isolated and distant from the mainland, perhaps one of the most famous blue zones in the world. Locals have lived here for thousands of years in small fishing and herding communities and cultivating grapes on the mountainsides that drop steeply into the Aegean Sea. Their isolation has made them vulnerable to the attacks of invaders, as well as the capricious gods of the sea, such that they have always been relatively poor and interdependent. This, we are told, has made them not only close-knit, but also very egalitarian, with strong social cohesion and little internal conflict. Ikarians, like many islander populations, have a very relaxed attitude to time, with few people wearing watches and little pressure to adhere to a schedule or get anywhere in a hurry. They are one of the few populations left in Europe that still take a siesta nap in the middle of the day, and then resume their work in the afternoon, after the heat of the Mediterranean sun has lessened. We have studies that show siestas to not only lower stress, blood pressure and cholesterol, but also, paradoxically, increase overall productivity in workers. There are no supermarkets on the island, with much of the wide variety of vegetables consumed as the foundation of their diet being grown locally or picked wild on the mountainside in the same way it's been done for thousands of years. The island is particularly noteworthy for its honey and its ancient variety of grape, from which an organic, unfiltered wine is particularly popular. Judging by the vintner showing Niklas around, and the derrieres of some of the other characters, there seems to be no deficiency of either grog or calories on the island. Moreover, walking the steep hillsides seems to be mostly a trait of the elderly, who remain physically active and even enjoy working for profit, while younger generations drive around and enjoy long coffees in tavernas. We are told that the ladies of the island enjoy a social freedom and equality that is unmatched in most parts of the world, and they even report a healthy sexual appetite well into their old age. Whether this is a reflection of accurate medical reporting or just Greek machismo is hard to say, so we have to take their word for it, although we know that stress and low self-esteem are high drivers of serotonin and sex hormone decline, so mental well-being, in this case, may trump waistline measurements so far as sexual vitality is concerned. The episode ends with a religious fundraising fiesta with plenty of barbecued pork chops, spit roast lamb and salads, which is a traditional part of the Mediterranean diet that doesn't get much airtime in dietary literature, but is nevertheless typical even where seafood is a staple. Indeed, every village has its own patron saint, feast days and fundraisers, such that there is a fiesta of some kind or other, with copious food and wine almost every weekend. So how can we summarise Ikaria? It's made very clear that they have a detached attitude to time pressures, and they make a lot of effort for family and friends, being heavily dependent on one another. Multi-generational living is common, though not ubiquitous, but the elderly are central to community life, being involved in religious activities and the preservation of cultural values. Ikaria benefits from its isolation, fresh sea air and mountainous terrain. There is a highly organised community spirit which depends on the involvement of volunteers rather than government subsidy. Their food is organic, homegrown or wild sourced, seasonal and freshly home cooked daily, combining typical Mediterranean foods such as olive oil, a high mix of fresh and seasonal vegetables, as well as goat and pork products. There is no obvious prohibition on alcohol or tobacco, and moreover, a pride in homemade local varieties of wine. We see, especially in the elderly, who are the outliers, a continuous, low-intensity physical labour, light fieldwork, and walking to stay healthy and maintain involvement in the economy. The really interesting and academically most interesting place is when Niklas visits Okinawa, because here in particular I had several of my preconceived ideas about longevity crushed. I had long been aware of the statistics that these Japanese were among the most long-lived people in the world, and that this has usually been attributed to their high intake of seafood and in particular seaweed. But as the episode opened, it was clear that our previous assumptions were, at best, incomplete. So, Okinawa is an island situated in the East China Sea, midway along a chain of tropical islands belonging to Japan called the Ryukyu Archipelago, that extend from its southern reaches right down to the coast of Taiwan. It's not a particularly elevated landscape, but it is fairly remote and subject to the tropical, humid Pacific weather typical of such climes, so nothing unusual geographically. Genetically, the people are a mix of indigenous Southeast Asian Okinawans who, through centuries of mixing with ethnic Japanese immigrants, are now a fairly homogeneous local population. Niklas meets up with a scientist involved in the study of aging, who, right off the bat, offers him an Okinawan donut, a deep-fried coloured ball of pastry mixed with taro root starch that happens to be a local favourite, and then, in conversation over a coffee, tells him that locals consume a lot of taro, a potato-like tuber, in contrast to their Japanese brethren, for whom rice is their main staple. He explains that taro may represent a part of the explanation for their longevity through its particular biochemical pathways, though this doesn't explain the lack of longevity or indeed the rampant obesity and diabetes of many other Pacific Island nations who also depend on taro as their base starch. As the conversation continues, Niklas seems surprised to learn that Okinawans are also unlike other Japanese in that they don't eat very much fish at all. Their main protein staple has always been pork, another piece of important information we never seem to be told by health experts, who drone endlessly on about the health benefits of Okinawan life extension diets. So, what we have here is basically a high-starch, high-fat diet with only modest seafood, but reasonable amounts of local seaweed called mozuku. He also tells our increasingly confused chef that Okinawans have an easygoing attitude to life that is diametrically opposite to the Japanese on the mainland, a kind of Okinawan Hakuna Matata, or some translation of que sera, sera, whatever will be, that makes them unsurprisingly stress resistant. Aha, curious. Anyway, we are soon introduced to a local chef who whisks him away to meet a remarkable old lady for a traditional Okinawan lunch, who, despite her advanced years, cooks for her family, goes to karaoke nights, and even has her own radio show, where she teaches the almost extinct indigenous Okinawan language, and through it shares her wisdom from the ages. We learn that during the Second World War there was much deprivation and hunger, until the Americans arrived with rescue packages of food that included Spam, canned sausages, and other packaged Yankee wonders that she now proceeded to cook into a stir-fry with a local vegetable and the ubiquitous tofu that seems to get so much credit in our hipster community as some kind of superfood. As if this wasn't weird enough, she then went on to make a salad out of a finely chopped local bitter herb into which she stirred a couple of spoonfuls of peanut butter. I kid you not, in front of our now bewildered Swedish chef, as if she was taking the piss out of us and the entire scientific community. Ever gracious, Niklas hid his astonishment behind exclamations of delight, but we're all left scratching our heads at how this supposedly constitutes either authentic Okinawan cuisine or health food in general. We cut back to our science guy, who explains how these older people were all physically active in their youth, as farmers or fishermen, and how they continue to remain active through their involvement in community get-togethers that involve karaoke singing and boogie time. Not exactly the stuff of tea ceremonies or kimono-clad geisha dancing, mind you, but a good time nevertheless. We get a short lecture in epigenetics, or the modification of gene expression, that basically means our DNA can be modified by the biochemical activity resulting from a multitude of dietary, psychosocial and environmental factors, with Science Guy rattling off a list of well-known antioxidants, free radical scavengers and repair factors that help to modify or suppress gene regulations for cancer, blood pressure, you name it. All the while, both Niklas and the audience are no doubt having flashbacks about Grandma Karaoke and her Spam peanut butter cancer stir-fry. Sensing more than a bit of confusion, Niklas' hosts whisk him away for some cultural immersion, first by visiting an old miso factory that uses ancient fermentation techniques to produce this supposedly healthy Japanese dietary classic that he is told lowers blood pressure and cholesterol, though it happens to be high in sodium and has been linked to hypertension in several studies. The very old yet active business owner is meant to be a reassuring sign that the product can't be that bad for us after all, since it's slow made and in a traditional way. Anyway, Science Guy tells us a bit more about the Okinawan return to cultural values, the slow food movement, and how an important motto in Okinawa is to push yourself away from the table while you still feel a bit hungry. Another aha moment. Niklas now makes his way to the seaside to experience the harvest of mozuku seaweed, which has been farmed on nets on the sea floor for hundreds of years, though it's unclear if the site is anywhere near the commercial shipping lanes or deep ocean waste outfalls that service the 1.2 million people of Naha, and whose waste, including heavy metals such as mercury, are sucked up and stored by seaweed more than any other plant on Earth. If you thought swordfish a la mercury was bad, you ain't seen nothing till you look at a seaweed study. Instead, Niklas is told that this seaweed contains a substance called fuikodan, which can cure Helicobacter pylori and hence prevent stomach cancers. Though a brief trawl through PubMed online shows nothing but in vitro or pilot studies and is hardly the stuff of Methuselan longevity, he eventually makes it back to dry land, and his chaperone finally takes him to his own restaurant, where he is treated to another traditional Okinawan meal, this time of slow-cooked sweet miso pork belly that might just as well have come from a Louisiana low and slow barbecue pit. And then he tried some deep-fried tempura mozuku seaweed that, while no doubt tender and delicious, being deep fried in polyunsaturated seed oils, likely both neutralised any fuikodan and could hardly be said to be a health food. In an attempt at cultural contrast, Niklas gets to meet a couple of locals that hang out in the nearby American Quarter, notable for its fast food joints, soft drinks, and all-round American junk food, with a couple of Japanese girls telling him how people now, even in their 50s, are succumbing to heart disease and diabetes because of it. They tell him this while themselves sucking down on soft drinks. Naughty Americans. Poor old Niklas needs a bit more cultural indoctrination, so they send him to an old karate master who kindly gives him the Mr. Miyagi treatment, having himself only taken up martial arts in his mid-30s. So both poor old Niklas and I are feeling a bit confused by now. But here are the key takeaways, I think, from Okinawa. The key point seems to be an easygoing islander attitude to life that contrasts sharply with that of Japan generally. They have strong family and social bonds and reverence for the older generation. They have a combination of multi-generational living and high community immersion, particularly embracing technology and entertainment, which is a novel way of keeping the elderly linked in with the changing world around them. Okinawans are less religious than their Japanese counterparts, with indigenous animist faiths uncomplicated by theologies, instead emphasizing ancestor worship. They live in a tropical, humid island climate, which has clean sea air, though the heat and humidity is hardly the stuff of alpine heather. They consume an astonishing hybrid of traditional and American home-cooked foods, comprised largely of taro, miso, fresh and seasonal vegetables, but there's no prohibition on deep-fried or processed foods that has little apparent nutritive uniqueness besides their increased consumption of seaweed. The type of physical labour or fitness undergone by the elderly appears less important than generally staying active, and overall it seems apparent that over the coming decades, Okinawa, like most of the other blue zones, will probably have worse metrics than the Japanese mainland. Now, you're probably sensing a creeping cynicism which became particularly pronounced in the Okinawa episode. I can only suppose this is because, firstly, the dietary factors that often get so much airtime and credit for longevity are largely absent or even contradictory to what we have been led to believe was the case. Thankfully, in the final episode, Niklas takes us back to his homeland of Sweden, where his old mate, science journalist and author Henrik Enart, concedes that diet seems to play only a minimal, if any, role in the longevity of populations around the world. He points out the interesting paradox that many people within the blue zones live in harsh conditions under challenging circumstances, physically and nutritionally, with the only tangible connection to diet being lack, that is to say, not overeating. The research tends to suggest that our Western overindulgence and continually full bellies, driven by an evolutionary drive to eat while there is food available, is at the heart of our problems in morbidity and mortality. Henrik tells us, tongue-in-cheek, that the healthiest diet is starvation, until it kills you. Nevertheless, accepting this pearl of wisdom and the Japanese equivalent of stopping when you're not yet full, the real common thread to longevity in these populations appears to be the strong social bonds within both the family and the community. But again, I've visited populations of Maasai in Kenya, as well as Tucano in the Amazon, who are thin as rakes, fit as fiddles and happy as Larry, but their demographics differ little from other herdsman populations, or for that matter, agricultural, fishermen, hunter-gatherer or even urban ones, even when factoring in disease and trauma, which ultimately suggests a weird baseline difference in genetics of these special blue zone communities. Niklas visits an old age home in Skane region of Sweden and chats with a couple of seniors about their strongest memories. Interestingly, it wasn't about war or suffering, but their relationships that constituted the key memories they recalled as significant in their lives. One of the old ladies told him she wished she didn't live any longer. She was tired, in constant pain. Most of her friends and family had already died, making for a lonely existence devoid of stimulation and laughter. She highlighted the freedom she experienced as a child, immersed in nature, family, and a farm life as significant factors in longevity, and told our chef he should spend less time on tech and communicate more with people face to face. He was also told to spend more time with both young and old people. So Niklas searches out a couple who used to have a restaurant, but whose 7-day-a-week rat race lifestyle, like his own, was becoming so destructive they gave it all up to live on a farm in the traditional ways of their ancestors. The work was hard but satisfying and stress-free, and things got real for our chef when he had to watch them kill a duck for their supper. He was impressed with the quality of their produce and the tranquility of their lives, as well as their turning away from the competitive wealth acquisition mentality that is typical of the rest of the world. But, for myself at least, I got the distinct impression of isolationism and a lack of community of the couple, who were nevertheless tied to the land 7 days a week, just as they were in their previous jobs, but now didn't even have the regular social interface they would have had in the restaurant. Niklas seemed to cotton on to the reality that while it might make a great getaway, few people could live happily in the isolated style of frontier life that this couple had embraced. He and Henrik went on to visit a pensioners group that were on an outing at a bowling alley. The group's spokesman told him that the single biggest issue in Sweden for the aged population was loneliness and the disconnection from society. Few people lived in extended communities anymore, and even in urban environments, their lack of mobility often kept them in isolation, despite excellent nutrition and medical care. Consequently, there was a growing movement to form associations that offered camaraderie, companionship, and adventure, but that members often had to be goaded out of their homes to participate. This was viewed as a huge challenge brewing in the West, for which adequate provision had to be made to make cities and societies compatible with the social and physical needs of the aging community. Niklas concludes the series by telling us that he started out wanting to live longer, but that by the end of the show, he just wanted to live better by spending more and more time with loved ones, and that he realized that life was more about quality than quantity. Henrik lamented the blue zones were likely to soon disappear, for the many reasons obvious throughout the series, but that they may help at least to point to those factors that really matter. So, if diet, altitude, geography, and genetics hasn't played a huge role in the longevity of blue zone centenarians, then to what can we assign most of the value as we try to apply those lessons to ourselves? It's been said that there are 3 things in life that make us sick: how we move, what we eat, and what we think. In other words, there are physical or mechanical factors, biochemical or what we might call dietary or environmental factors, and finally there are psychosocial factors, for which we could include variables of mental attitude, resilience, cultural conditioning, social inclusion, or a sense of belonging, spiritual faith, and an empathy with nature and other living things. The characteristics of blue zone elders suggests that a lifestyle involving modest physical exercise, particularly in fitness and strength, where some ongoing involvement in meaningful work exists, is critical to stay healthy. Time in nature appears to be beneficial, though we could argue that the value is more emotional than physical. Diet is the real wildcard here. The food presented in the episodes range from pristine, natural, old-school cooking and wild harvest to the simple, starchy subsistence food of poverty, right down to a questionably healthful mishmash of traditional and processed food. But the elephant in the room is clearly the fact that these people all live in close-knit communities, with strong kinship and cultural bonds that can be based on religious, family, regional factors, or a combination of all three. Viktor Frankl, eminent psychiatrist and Auschwitz survivor, was a firm believer in the need for our lives to have a purpose or a meaning in order for us to be truly healthy. This can take the form of personal development, expanding your own skills, abilities and knowledge. It can also take the form of community participation, such as mentoring young people, volunteering for worthy causes, teaching, or in unselfish creative pursuits that plant a proverbial tree, the shade of which you will yourself never get to sit under. It might involve participating in a club, society or charity where there is a strong feel-good factor, or perhaps, like this channel, hopes to put out content that might help turn somebody's life around, or even hopefully save one. So let's summarize everything we've learned so we can implement a couple of strategies right away. Number 1. Spend more time with friends and family, both young and old. Number 2. Keep check of your competitive, materialist tendencies. Take some action to remedy excess and review regularly. Number 3. Do some work, even if it's just a hobby, that you find mentally stimulating and personally interesting. Number 4. Do some regular low-intensity exercise, like walking uphill or leaving your car in the garage when you go to the shops. Number 5. Take a siesta or 40 winks at lunchtime and see if it helps you. Number 6. Don't eat till you're full. Always aim to leave some room in your stomach. And number 7. Take an interest in your community and volunteer to help in some regular way that doesn't involve profit for yourself. While we can all agree that big problems require big solutions, to me this series of videos suggested that the chief characteristic of Blue Zone longevity is largely social, and that additionally making a couple of little changes in each of the other areas, such as not overeating and doing some moderate exercise and sustaining these over time, can literally help put years in your life and life in your years. I hope you've got something from this. Please do leave a comment, give us a like and subscribe for updates, and I'd really appreciate if you share this video with your friends. Anyway, till next time, walk tall. Cheers.